On the Turkish coast, at the eastern end of the Gulf of İskenderun, there is a mound 26 meters high, sitting 500 meters inland from a sea that has since pulled away from it. In 1992, a team from Bilkent University began cutting into it. Somewhere in that stack of centuries is the layer where the most connected world the planet had ever produced stopped functioning. Empires that had fought each other to a standstill were gone within a generation, and the force blamed for it has carried the same name for 150 years. The Sea Peoples. Where they came from and what became of them afterward has never been settled. But the name itself was invented in the 1800s by a man who never saw any of this ground, and almost nobody has gone back to ask what it was hiding. Start with a shipwreck, because a shipwreck is a balance sheet that sank. In 1984, archaeologists began raising a vessel from the seabed off Uluburun on the southwestern Turkish coast. It was about 50 feet long, and it had gone down around 1300 BC. In the hold were 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, tin brought overland from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, pottery from Greece, glass, resin, ebony, ostrich eggshell, a single hull carrying the material output of half the known world. That cargo is usually presented as evidence of how magnificent the Bronze Age had become. Read it the other way and it tells you something much less comfortable. If the metal for your army has to arrive by ship from 4 separate directions, you do not have an empire. You have an account that has to keep clearing. By the 14th and 13th centuries BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had assembled something genuinely unprecedented. Egypt in the southwest, the Hittite Empire holding Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece to the northwest, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east, smaller, wealthy kingdoms like Ugarit threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, corresponded with each other, and married into each other. We know this in detail because roughly 350 cuneiform tablets recovered at Amarna in Egypt preserve the actual diplomatic mail of that world. Great kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating shipments of gold, complaining at length when a shipment arrived short. The language they wrote in was Babylonian, not because Babylon ruled anyone, but because centuries of contact had produced a common diplomatic tongue by default. That detail alone tells you how integrated this had become. What held it together militarily was the chariot. Fast, expensive, and devastating on flat ground, it was the tank of the Bronze Age. It was also the perfect weapon for a wealthy, centralized state, because you needed skilled craftsmen to build them, trained horses to pull them, professional warriors to drive them, and a surplus economy to pay for all three. And chariot armies ran on bronze. Bronze requires tin. Tin, for most of this period, came from thousands of kilometers away, moving overland through half a dozen intermediaries before it reached a smith in Greece or Egypt. Recent isotope work suggests European sources reached the Mediterranean as well, which widens the supply but does not change the shape of the problem. Copper came from Cyprus. Grain moved north out of Egypt. Consider what that arrangement actually means. Every major power in the Eastern Mediterranean had built its army out of a metal it could not produce, using a supply line it did not control, running through territory belonging to somebody else. That is not a description of a golden age. That is a description of an exposure. Remove one node and the flow slows. Remove several at once and the whole architecture of exchange begins to buckle. By the late 13th century, the reports coming in were troubling. Famine in the Hittite highlands, year after year. In Greece, palaces suddenly spending on wall extensions. Then something arrived that the Egyptians wrote down, and the name we gave it has been bending the question ever since. Nobody in the ancient world ever called them the Sea Peoples. That is not a technicality. It is the single most distorting fact in this entire subject, and it goes almost unmentioned in most accounts. The Egyptians named individuals groups, and they named them separately. The Peleset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. 5 carved into the reliefs of the 1177 campaign, part of a wider roster of 9 or 10 that appears across Egyptian records spanning several decades. Different names, different headdresses, different weapons, different ships recorded at different times. What the Egyptians never did, not once, was give them a collective title. That was supplied 3,000 years later by a Frenchman. The Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouge, working in the mid-1800s, described the nations depicted at Medinet Habu as peoples of the sea. His successor, Gaston Maspero, took the phrase, popularized it, and attached it to the migration theories that were fashionable in European scholarship at the time. Grand movements of whole populations sweeping across continents, framed in the racial categories that 19th century Europe applied to almost everything it studied. The framework stuck. The interpretations shifted around it for the next 150 years, but the label held. Consider what that label quietly installed. A single term was laid over 9 or 10 separate peoples, and then treated as though it named one thing. Every question asked since has carried that singular inside it. Where did they come from? What drove them? Where did they go? Each of those questions assumes a they, and the they was invented in Paris. Now go back to the reliefs themselves, because they have a problem of their own. Around 1177 BC, black sails appeared off the Egyptian coast, sleek war vessels moving into the mouth of the Nile, carrying warriors whose appearance struck the Egyptians as foreign. Feathered headdresses on some, horned helmets on others, armor mixing heavy plate and light leather, long slashing swords and javelins rather than the bows and spears that had defined Bronze Age fighting for centuries. Ramesses III met them, and according to Ramesses III, he won. Pharaohs always won. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu, his mortuary complex at Thebes, describe total and glorious victory in exactly the language Egyptian royal propaganda had been using for 1,000 years. The enemy is crushed. The pharaoh is triumphant. The gods are satisfied. What is unusual is not the triumphalism. It is the scale of threat the text felt obliged to describe first. According to the inscription, no land had been able to stand before these people. They had already torn through Hatti, through Carchemish, through Arzawa, through Alashia, a trail of destruction that matches the archaeological record of collapsed civilizations across the entire eastern Mediterranean, ending at Egypt's door. A pharaoh who was genuinely winning did not need to explain quite so carefully how dangerous the enemy had been, and the same reliefs preserve one detail the propaganda could not scrub out. It does not look like an invasion at all. Carved alongside the warships and the fighting men at Medinet Habu are ox carts, solid-wheeled, slow, loaded with women, children, and household possessions. Armies do not bring furniture. Whatever else was happening on the Nile that year, at least some of these people were not raiding. They were moving with everything they owned, looking for somewhere to put it down permanently. That single detail sits badly against every version of the story in which a war fleet arrives, destroys, and withdraws. It is not the only thing that refuses to fit. Start with the timing. The attack on Ramesses III was not the first. It was the second major attempt on Egypt within roughly 30 years. Around 1207 BC, his predecessor Merneptah had already turned back a combined Libyan and Sea Peoples force on the western approaches to the delta, including groups named as the Sheridan, the Shekelesh, and the Loka. Push further back, and the same names appear again, as pirates, as raiders, as mercenaries hired by the states they would later be accused of destroying. This was not an eruption from nowhere. It was a pressure that had been building for decades. Then there is the Sheridan problem, which is the strangest of all of them. Sheridan warriors show up in Egyptian records long before 1177. They fought at Kadesh. They served as Ramesses II's personal bodyguard, the men closest to the pharaoh's body. And earlier in that same reign, they had launched a failed raid on the Nile themselves. A relationship spanning 3 centuries, oscillating between service and hostility, sometimes within a single lifetime. That does not read as foreign invasion. It reads as a permanent feature of how that world worked. Now look at what actually burned. At several sites across the collapse, the destruction pattern is specific rather than general. The palace complex is leveled. The settlements around it are not. Outside invaders sweeping through a region do not make that distinction. They take what is portable and burn what is in the way. People who knew exactly which building they wanted gone make that distinction. Populations that had supported palace economies through generations of taxation and conscription, now watching those economies fail to protect them from famine and raiding, may have drawn their own conclusions about where the problem was located. And underneath all of it, two lines of evidence that no ancient scribe recorded because no ancient scribe could see them. Pollen extracted from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean shows a prolonged, severe drought beginning around 1200 BC. Rainfall dropped sharply across large areas. In highland kingdoms like Hatti, already hard to feed in a good year and already dependent on grain shipped enormous distances from Egypt, sustained crop failure was not an economic inconvenience. Seismological analysis of the 12th century shows a remarkable clustering of major earthquakes across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. And Egypt, the one great power that survived, sits outside that seismic zone. Every one of those details makes the invaders harder to see as invaders. Testing that required evidence nobody had until about 10 years ago. For most of human history, the dead kept their origins to themselves. Whatever distances their ancestors had crossed went into the ground with them. Then ancient DNA arrived, and the most obvious place to point it was Ashkelon. Ashkelon sits on the southern Levantine coast, one of the 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis, and it had been excavated for decades. The archaeological case that its Iron Age population came from somewhere else was already the strongest anywhere in the Sea Peoples debate. Aegean-style pottery in the earliest occupation layers, entirely unlike anything Canaan had produced before. Changed architecture, changed diet, including a sharp rise in pig consumption in a region that had not eaten much pork. All of it circumstantial, all of it arguable. A team led by Mikkel Feldman at the Max Planck Institute, working with Daniel Master and colleagues, extracted genetic material from individuals buried at Ashkelon across the Bronze to Iron Age transition. The results were published in Science Advances in 2019. The earliest Iron Age burials carry a clear component of Southern European ancestry. It is simply absent from the Canaanite population that had occupied the same ground in the preceding centuries. This was not a marginal statistical trace. It was a genuine discontinuity, marking the arrival of people from somewhere across the Mediterranean in exactly the decades the Egyptian records describe. For the first time in 150 years, the pottery and the biology were saying the same thing at the same moment. That should have closed the case. It didn't, because the same study contains a second finding, and it dismantles the first question by answering a different one. Within roughly 2 centuries, that European signal has largely dissolved. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it has blended into the surrounding Levantine population until it is no longer separable from it. They arrived, they settled, they married the people who were already there, and their descendants became genetically indistinguishable from their neighbours, while continuing to be called Philistines by everyone around them for another 500 years. The identity outlived the biology by centuries, which means the thing everyone had been trying to trace was never a bloodline in the first place, and there is a harder limit on what Ashkelon can do. The Peleset are one group out of 9 or 10. The study establishes where some of them came from. It says nothing about the Sheridan or the Luka or the Denyen or the Weshesh. It does not identify a shared genetic signature tying the named groups to each other because none has been found. There is no single origin population. The Egyptian reliefs, for once, were accurate in showing a coalition rather than a nation. And Ashkelon is in the wrong place for the biggest part of the question. Egypt survived. The Levantine coast survived. The empires that actually died, Hatti above all, died in the north, along a coastline the Egyptian fleet never had to defend. For that, you have to go to the coast the ships sailed past. The northeastern corner of the Mediterranean is a hinge. Everything moving between the Aegean and the Levant has to round it. Ships coming out of Cyprus make landfall there. Overland routes from inland Syria come down through the mountains to meet the water there. If anything moved south during the collapse, it passed this corner first, which is where the mound comes in. Kinet Höyük stands at the eastern end of the Gulf of İskenderun, in the narrow strip of ground between the sea and the Amanus Mountains. It covers about 3 1/3 hectares and rises 26 meters, and it was occupied continuously from the late Neolithic into the medieval period. It sits 500 meters from the modern shoreline, which is misleading. Geomorphological survey has established that it originally stood on a natural promontory, with a stream estuary to the south and a small inlet to the north. It was a harbor. Marie Henriette Gates directed excavations there for Bill Kent University from 1992 to 2008, cutting down through 6,000 years of stacked occupation. What that sequence shows for the late Bronze Age is a town being absorbed. Through the Middle Bronze Age, Kinet had kept a regional Cilician identity while prospering from the maritime trade running up and down the Levantine coast. Then, around 1500 BC, Hittite pressure arrived, and the material culture of the site converts to that of central Anatolia. The process was sudden, thorough, and permanent. Kinet became the Hittite seaport of Izia, which is to say, it became the empire's access to the sea. Then the empire that owned it ceased to exist. The most useful evidence to come out of that ground recently is not a weapon or a burnt gate. It is charcoal. A systematic study published in 2025 worked through the site's Bronze to Iron Age plant remains and found a strong reduction in olive tied directly to the late Bronze Age trade collapse. Consider what that actually records. Olive is a long-term crop. You plant it for your grandchildren. A population stops maintaining olive groves when the market those groves supplied has gone, or when nobody expects to still be there in 20 years. That is economic failure written into what people were burning and growing, rather than into somebody's victory monument. Gunnar Lehman has published specifically on this transition and on what he calls the problem of the Sea Peoples phenomenon in Cilicia, and the word problem is doing real work in that title. Because here is what the Cilician sequence does not show. It does not show a coastline emptied. It does not show a clean destruction horizon followed by silence. The sites along this stretch keep being occupied through the transition, with the pottery and the architecture changing while the people stay. No trench on this coast has solved anything, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. What this ground provides is continuity, which means whatever happened next was written here rather than ended here. And about 30 kilometers inland, a different mound has produced a name. Tell Tayinat sits in the Amuk Plain in Hatay province on the Orontes, in the flat farmland between the mountains and the sea. Renewed excavation there has been working on precisely the window that everything else in this story falls into, roughly 1200 to 1000 BC, a stretch the northern Levant was calling a dark age, for the straightforward reason that almost nothing written survives from it. Two things have come out of that ground. The first is pottery, late Helletic 3C painted ware recovered across multiple seasons, Aegean-style bowls, craters, and amphorae with the decorative vocabulary that goes with them. Brian Janeway published the full stylistic analysis in 2017, and the title he chose for it is itself a question. Sea Peoples of the Northern Levant, with a question mark. The second is writing, and it is the reason this site matters more than any other in this video. Inscriptions from Tayinat and from the surrounding region, carved in hieroglyphic Luwian, record an early Iron Age kingdom that appears to have been capitaled at this mound. Its king was named Taita. The kingdom was called Palistin. In later inscriptions, the same name is written Wollaston. Peleset. Palistin. Philistine. One consonant apart, 600 kilometers and a coastline between them, the same century. Now the case against it, because it is substantial and it is made by serious people. Trevor Bryce holds that the connection between the biblical Philistines and the kingdom of Palistin remains a hypothesis, and that further excavation is required before it can be established as anything more. And most of what Tayinat has actually produced looks like a conventional Luwian state. The Neo-Hittite inhabitants used predominantly red-slipped burnished ware, which is completely unlike the Aegean-type pottery associated with the earlier phase at the site. The royal names of Palistin and of its successor kingdom are Hittite, not Aegean, and there is no demonstrated link between Taita and the old Hittite royal house. So the scorecard runs three ways, and none of the three closes. The Ashkelon genetics, a real arrival, unambiguous, and one group out of 9 or 10. The Tayinat pottery, a real Aegean presence in southern Turkey in exactly the right decades, with the meaning contested. The Palestine inscriptions, a real kingdom with a real name, and an identification that specialists have been arguing about for 20 years. Each survives one kind of scrutiny and stumbles on another. But look at the shape underneath all three, because the shape survives everything. In the south, an incoming Aegean-derived population found cities, and within 2 centuries is biologically indistinguishable from its neighbours while still being called Philistine. In the north, a kingdom with an Aegean-flavored name and Aegean pottery appears on top of a Luwian landscape, and within a few generations is functionally a Luwian state with Hittite kings. That is not 2 mysteries. That is one process, running twice in opposite corners of the same sea. Vanished is the wrong word. Go back to the mound on the Gulf of İskenderun. 26 meters of stacked centuries, standing 500 meters from a sea that is quietly withdrawn from it, holding the layer where the most connected world the planet had produced stopped clearing its accounts. The question was built wrong in the 1800s. A single label was laid across 9 or 10 separate peoples, and every generation since has gone looking for one homeland and one ending for something that never possessed either. They were not a nation. They did not disappear. They were what a collapsing system does with the people it can no longer feed, and they went where such people have always gone, which is into whoever was already living there. The sea peoples were never a mystery about where a civilization went. They were the answer to what a civilization turns into.